So welcome to this conversation where we are, unfortunately, I'm sorry to disappoint you, not going to answer the question, what works in atrocity prevention? Because this is just the first step of trying to find out what works in atrocity prevention. I have invited this wonderful panel to join that conversation, and I also hope that we will have this conversation with the audience and in the coffee breaks. And before we move on to the discussion with the panel, I want to give a short introduction on where this conversation starts. Atrocity prevention, I would argue, is a field in crisis. It's actually, maybe it's always been a field in crisis. It has never worked perfectly. But at this moment in time, we're in a situation where the multilateral level, particularly the UN Security Council, is deadlocked. There is a normative breakdown where major states challenge the norms that are supposed to protect civilians against atrocities. So as researchers, what are we going to do? We've just got bad news from your project at Uppsala, Magnus, that there are a record number of conflicts between states. And there's also a very high number of one-sided violence against civilians, which is basically what we are talking about when we're talking about atrocities. So what should we as researchers do, and how should we communicate this to practitioners? One thing that we should do, I would argue, is to study cases of resistance and self-protection and trying to figure out what can work in prevention. To give one example, I'm working on a book project at the moment together with Gyda, who will speak to you later from the panel, and another colleague, Claire Smith, where we have asked the question, how do civilians protect themselves against atrocities from the bottom up? A lot of research in this field has looked at how outsiders should rescue civilians, but that actually doesn't really happen that often. So what we have looked at is how do civilians and organizations on the ground strategize to respond to atrocity risks, ongoing atrocities, and past atrocities. However, this is quite an explorative project, and what I would like to do with this conversation is to move it in a more structured direction. So what do we know in the field of atrocity prevention? Well, actually, we know quite a lot in terms of the risk factors of mass atrocities. These are typically quantitative studies that can predict atrocities with quite an impressive degree of accuracy. In this field, the research field of atrocity prevention, there is a broad recognition that these quantitative studies must be combined with qualitative, in-depth, and very context-sensitive studies of the places that are scoring high on the atrocity risk assessment in these studies. And then we move on to what we in this atrocity prevention field call early warning, which is typically more qualitative studies of countries that are already high in risk. And we know also from these studies quite a lot about warning signs and trigger mechanisms. So we know a lot about when atrocities happen. They very rarely come as a surprise, as has been also said earlier today. But when it comes to what works, what are the success stories, of course, that's a lot more difficult to study. It's very difficult to analyze for many reasons that I guess some of you will comment on, and we can come back to that. We have some sort of anecdotal success stories, but it is difficult. And just to give a shout out to the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities, who I've been collaborating with on this idea and this project. They've just now put together this risk assessment toolkit that kind of combines what we know in terms of risk assessment and early warning. So together with them, I've been thinking about how to move forward and analyze what may work. One of the examples of these risk assessment tools is this one that you're responsible for, Lawrence, from the Simon Schutz Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. It's a picture of your map. It's one of the best known of these statistical early warning tools, and you can say more about that yourself. So how can we use these types of data sets for better case selection? As I said, one of the problems in the study of how atrocity prevention actually works is that we have these very few anecdotal cases. So can we use data sets, for example, to identify cases that have been very high in terms of risk for a number of years, but that haven't actually had atrocities? Can we look at cases that have had a decrease in atrocity risk? Can we find anything interesting from doing case studies of those cases, or do we just are we then just moving in circles and looking at sort of the same data that feeds into the data sets, like more structural background factors? So how can we use these data sets that identify countries at high risk and select some of those countries and see what has happened in a more qualitative manner in those countries? Another question that I want to discuss with you is, are there any similar research projects that we can learn from? I know that you, Michaela, you have your PhD project that seems to be very relevant for this kind of thinking. And then moving on, how should comparative case studies of atrocity prevention be designed? And this is where I want to bring Gyda into the conversation with your studies of post-conflict, post-war societies. So moving on to the panel discussion, I wanted to start with you, Lawrence. As the research director at the Simon Schutz Center for the Prevention of Genocide, this is, I think, a question that everyone in atrocity prevention struggles with. How can we figure out what actually works? So, give the floor to you.
Well, thanks, Ellen, for pulling this conversation together. It's I don't hardly need to underscore how urgent and important it is. I guess I wanted to start with offering a few thoughts on why this is such a hard question to actually make progress on, and then a couple of ideas about what we have learned about this question through an attempt to review the existing knowledge on this question that we've engaged in. So I think firstly, Ellen, you're highlighting this question of case selection for new studies, which to me I think is a version of a more fundamental challenge in understanding what works in atrocity prevention, which is related to the inability to observe the counterfactual. So we can't simultaneously observe what happens after preventive action is taken, and in the same case, or an identical case, what happens following the absence of that preventive action. This is a challenge we're all familiar with when we do causal research, but is particularly sticky in our context here. But there are some other challenges as well. Selection bias is a prominent one as well, because if we're looking at actions that are initiated by policy decision makers, we can assume that they choose to do things that they think will be helpful. So the application of these measures is not as if random. It's actually driven by an assessment of what works, which means that if we just take those cases where things were done and we try to assess the impact, we're likely to develop biased measures of the effects. And then thirdly, we have to be very sensitive to non-public information that may be unavailable to researchers. So, for example, we may be able to observe that in a set of cases there were diplomatic efforts to try to prevent atrocities, but what do we know about what happened in those diplomatic conversations? Probably very little. Maybe the things that were driving the effects were actually about the nature and content of those conversations, which we as researchers won't know about. If we just then attribute the effects to the absence or presence of diplomatic actions, we're likely to miss what's actually underneath the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of the actions. So there's a whole set of these challenges for researchers. At the Simon Schutz Center, we tried to do a sort of stock taking of what it is we know from existing research on a set of 15 what we call atrocity prevention tools. So just think of the categories of things that outside policymakers tend to do to try to prevent or respond to atrocities, ranging from naming and shaming, mediation, peace operations, financial sanctions, and the like. We reviewed research published from 1990 to 2023, which included almost 600 different studies. In short, we found no answer to the question of what works in preventing atrocities. Across every tool, we found a mix of top-line findings of whether those tools were effective or ineffective. But that doesn't suggest that we know nothing about when and how these tools work. So we really focused on which factors are associated with greater or lesser effectiveness of these tools. So some of those factors relate to the context in which they're used. Some of them relate to the manner they're designed and implemented. So I just highlight 4 factors that across multiple tools are associated with greater effectiveness. And these are probably unsurprising to most of us, but important to affirm that they come out in this kind of systematic review. The commitment of the preventive actor, the presence of international support or coordination, the use of multiple tools concurrently, and the application of these tools without bias towards one group or another. So really, I mean, you can think that responses that are robust, well-coordinated, diversified, and applied even-handedly are more likely to be effective in general. And the last point is, I think we observed, is that looking at this body of research, just more of the same is unlikely to address the key gaps. We see an increase in the amount of research that's being published, and also in the sophistication and the quality of the research, but there's this challenge of synthesis, which is often something that's not at the forefront of the minds of individual researchers, but we have sort of a collective action problem. We're in a collective enterprise of trying to build knowledge on these topics, but if we're not thinking of how our individual study will build on the existing body of knowledge and be able to be synthesized with what already exists, we're likely to miss some important opportunities.
Thank you, Lawrence. Magnus, you just published the data from the Uppsala conflict data program. It's pretty depressive. It's not a good picture. Is there any possibility to extract some information from this data that can be used for more qualitative research on prevention?
Well, I think we don't collect data on atrocity prevention, obviously, but using some of the predictive models out there, I think we can identify we can identify using our data the cases where it happened, but we could also, using the predictive models, identify the near misses or the false positives, and comparing those with each other would be one way to try to get a handle on the inference problem. It's not a perfect one, but I think we can improve that by also disaggregating our analysis, so we can get better control over various other factors by comparing, say, villages or regions of a country and the frequency and scale of atrocities across those, more comparable than, say, 2 different nations or nation states. So you would need something like a difference in difference model, so you could track 2 very similar cases that are on the same kind of trajectory, where in one case atrocities happen and the other does not, and then you could go in and look at, and I think especially intriguing, see what is done locally, not just what is sent in from the outside. Because what's done locally doesn't suffer from the selection bias problem then, because they're there already, they didn't choose to go there. So that would avoid some of those problems. One of the problems looking at the subnational level is that you may have spillover effects. So if there are measures taken, atrocity prevention measures taken in one place, then the perpetrators of atrocities may choose to go elsewhere if it's known that these measures have been taken. So The atrocities may not have been prevented, they just have been displaced to a different location. The non-random treatment we already talked about. Another consideration is what level of analysis do we think the causal process is taking place that generates the atrocities? You can imagine that there is a local commander who is not psychologically well or particularly mean and evil, who does this for personal reasons or for, you can look at research on civil war, there are lots of private disputes that also play out. It's not just the claimed cause by the, say, rebels and the government and so on, or the two different parties. There's also private vendettas going on and things like that. Is that what's driving this? Or is it a more group-centric or a national project that's the ethnic cleansing or the genocide? That will matter also for understanding what's going on here, if it's being displaced or if it's how much various atrocity prevention measures taken at different levels will have an effect, and so you need to consider that also in choosing the level of analysis. Finally, I'd like to point out that in the spirit of know your data, that atrocities in the UCDP are not only in the one-sided violence data. It is also in the battle-related deaths. So almost all of the atrocities in Gaza are in the battle-related deaths. Right? We have civilian fatalities in the battle-related deaths. We also have many unknown, most of which typically are civilian, but we were unable to determine that with a sufficient degree of confidence, so we left them in the unknown category. So a lot of atrocities going on there also, so don't forget that. And I think the same is true if you use ACLED data. There their categorization structure is hierarchical, so you may have violence against civilians, but if it's with the same actors on the same day in the same place, also a battle, then those fatalities will be folded into the battle deaths, if I'm not incorrect. And she's nodding, so I think I got that right. So it's for both those data, there is fatalities. Atrocities will be not only in the violence against civilians or the one-sided violence, that will also be in the battle-related deaths.
Yes, thank you. I think it's worth just noting that when we talk about mass atrocities in a more formal legal sense, that is also included, because atrocities are legally serious war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide. Yeah. So that will be the serious war crimes category. Håvard, I'd like to hear your input as a director of Views and Professor at Prio. I guess you've been struggling with this issue of both what can you actually capture with the data and how can that be put into practice, particularly with Views. That seems to be one of the aims. So what are your thoughts? And then particularly on this issue of case selection through the data sets.
Yeah, I mean, just like to note one thing first is that we know quite a bit. We know quite a lot about what works. We've learned from the peaceful decade, the first decade of this century, that where both the number of armed conflicts were at a global, all historic low, and the one-sided violence low. So you know that democracy support is effective. We know that international engagement and the strengthening of norms against use of violence for political goals, strengthening norms against using violence against civilians. We know that's effective. We also know that peacekeeping operations has been super effective. The problem is it's not so much maybe that we don't know what works, but that we don't have the political will to implement this. So that's just one observation which I think fits here. As more for the technical things, I mean, one thing which I noticed that most of the one-sided violence or violence against civilians in general is today, and maybe more today than earlier, is connected with the other types of armed conflict. So almost all the one-sided violence, which is large-scale induced by dataset, is in the same locations used by some of the actors engaged in armed conflict, either internal conflict or interstate conflict. So most of the cases of really mass atrocities, like the Tigray conflict, the Gaza, the Mariupol, so all those are connected with armed conflict. So, so to some extent, the question of preventing atrocities, can that really be distinguished from preventing armed conflict and preventing political leaders to use violence in a military sense too? So I don't think it's really useful to make a clear distinction. But then maybe there is some leverage from looking at which armed conflicts are executed with relatively low proportions of one-sided violence. I mean, I think, so Niger and Burkina Faso are kind of the same type of ecosystem of armed conflict, but it looks like the one-sided violence is much more prevalent in Burkina Faso than Nigeria, but there's probably something to learn there from looking at that. Otherwise, the obvious methodological tool is to look at false positives, as Magnus mentioned. So where do these various forecasting models predict lots of one-sided violence or atrocities or armed conflict for that sake? And where do the predictions fail? So that maybe there's something to learn from that. One challenge with that is that often these are just latent situations that just wait to happen. We used to have, in 2022, the top currently non-conflict countries on our list were Sudan and Israel-Gaza, Israel-Palestine. Great false positive, but then not anymore. So that are kind of the challenges of using the false positives too, that you don't know when they will be that predictions will kick in and be correct, unfortunately. So it's hard.
Yeah. Thank you. Michaela, you have this really interesting PhD project on that you say you're interested in the prospects of peace amidst high conflict risk, and your project is on dynamics of restraint in civil war. And do you see any parallels, any ideas of what you've learned from that can feed into this kind of project?
Yes, well, we're very much in line with what has already been raised by my colleagues here. Yes, so to begin, I want to state that there is a long-standing tradition in peace and conflict research to study this kind of on-the-brink cases, to understand what prevents civil war. But again, we are facing the same endogeneity challenges as in atrocity prevention research. So we draw on similar literature like Scott Strauss's work, that's very much guiding, so that's retreating from the brink, basically. There are ongoing projects at our department as well, for instance, led by Assistant Professor Johan Brochet, Crossing the Rubicon, and they studied the severity of civil wars. And there, of course, we have one-sided violence included. And also projects being developed, like by Karina Mraz and colleagues. So putting my doctoral project into this kind of context, I study, as I mentioned also earlier, why some of these underbrink cases do not reach the stage of armed conflict. And I look both at how countries are not equally receptive to conflict triggers, but also what kind of early stage prevention has a causal impact, so to say. So looking, for instance, at the bargaining strategies, early stage negotiation with or without third-party support. And I do this using both causal inference designs and forecasting methods. So drawing a lot on the applied empirical economics and causal machine learning as well. So I want to state here as well that we are facing the same counterfactual that is at the core of this discussion. And this is because when we ask what works to prevent, we are asking a causal question. We are asking about a causal effect, a causal impact. So it hinges on that identification, like what would have happened otherwise. So maybe we are familiar with this from randomization, and this is one strategy are experiments, but here, if we are talking about an intervention, that is not random, nor are the risk factors or the targeted interventions. But then what I want to highlight is that we can work with other assumptions. We don't need to work with the kind of randomization of the intervention, but rather we work with assumptions of parallel trends, for instance. And that is, for instance, in the difference in designs. And especially, perhaps, we want to look at the conditional parallel trends. Like, in which contexts would we expect cases to be similar in the trajectory, so to say. So what I do then to construct counterfactuals is first working with the early stage data sets, both the candidate events from the UCDP and also raw UCDP data stretching further back. And these unvetted data are cases that have been recorded over time that never reached the threshold of active armed conflict, meaning that in that case we have a case universe of the wars that never were, so to say. But I want to really stress here that if we are to work with unvetted data, that means that we have to know our data, we have to go back to the data generating process and work with the data quality, basically. And personally, at this stage, I'm working with it to train models. Another approach I use is to construct counterfactuals using feasible values in the training data to synthetically, artificially construct the counterfactual. So these are strategies that can be used in applied econometrics that have been developed precisely for these more tricky questions in terms of endogeneity. And for this, I use both machine learning and the near misses. We can talk more about that. So my key point is that for case selection, we need to think about the identifying assumptions already at the start. So what makes this a good or valid counterfactual? And this is the same for both large and small N studies. So we can think about the identification in the three approaches that you suggest. Like when we look at how cases that have seen a reduction in risk, then the risk itself is the outcome, and that is what we need to kind of build our models on targeting. Secondly, in terms of high risk, no atrocities, that may be a case of heterogeneity, and we have ways to work with that as well. And thirdly, with the near misses, this is where we can use them to explore inductively what works or what could be the missing factor in our model. But I want to highlight here that this is not we don't have identification given per se here. So this is where we have to work inductively. Now in my project, I am developing ways to actually use those false positives or near misses in an inference design as well. But that is early work, and it again works with the conditional parallel trends, basically. So we can talk more about these strategies as we move on as well.
Thank you. Gida, we worked together on this book on atrocity resistance, and as I said in my presentation, the atrocity prevention field is really characterized by this combination of quantitative and more qualitative work to understand atrocity risks, and atrocity triggers and warning signs. And if we wanted to select cases based on, for instance, false positives, how could those studies then be designed? What are your thoughts on how to move forward with that?
Thank you so much. And I'm following up on these excellent contributions as well, bringing this additional lens to the discussion. And I think before I answer your question, Ellen, I also want to highlight the importance of the data that we are using to also reflect additional intervention mechanisms related to mass atrocities that are actually not happening through external interventions or external support mechanisms, especially in this day and age. And I think one of the most important findings through this collaborative work and inductive work on civilian resistance to mass atrocities, which covers a number of cases over time, and where authors are looking at, researchers are sort of looking at specific data either at different historical periods in the same context, or explaining through as an assumed expected risk what the resistance mechanisms are. That this is very much often happening at the local level within communities. Resilience work happens beyond that level. And I think if we are specifically focusing on today's scenario of peace building, where there is less likelihood, as you said, Hova, in terms of international interventions, there's less political will of doing what one would know works. This is also where we need more data and better understanding of how communities are responding through this. And I think we started this conversation also by thinking not in terms of the false positives as such, but between distinguishing or identifying non-events, which is slightly different. It's a sort of allowing us to be a little bit more flexible. So we can use the data sets to sort of say these are high-risk cases, and we can identify cases where there is a reduction in risk, and we can ask what factors is it that shape that reduction in risk, right? So we can identify some structural interventions, structural factors and interventions, but there are also some unexpected factors in there that can be further explored, I think, and that's very much needed through this comparative design and a bottom-up design. Secondly, also, of course, we have the cases where there's a sustained high risk, and I think sustained high risk for mass atrocities is not necessarily only large-scale deaths, right? So it's also can be in local communities where the numbers of atrocity crimes that are, or deaths following atrocity crimes, or where actually it might be more about expulsion of communities, etc., that might not reach those big data sets. So that's also worth looking at. This also moves on to the importance of subnational level, right? And then obviously is the near misses that we are interested in as well. I think it's important to assume that non-events doesn't automatically mean a success of a prevention mechanisms. There can also be other factors in place, right? So there might not have happened that trigger event. Perpetrator might have lacked capacity, or there's been a shifting in the global system, or where your funds and support for running your armed campaign, for instance. So that's changes in the conflict dynamics and so forth. So I think these are important factors to keep in mind when it comes to that. So in terms of how we can design that comparative framework, I think we can use the data that's there, very much prevalent, and then I would like to see more attention to. I wouldn't go as far as to saying less rigor, because that would be very unpopular in this setting. But it's a recognition about what can be a learning lesson for policy communities, and through that engagement. So we know a lot of international NGOs in the peace building space are doing a lot of that work in working with communities, in working through social cohesion mechanisms and developing that kind of frameworks, which is not an external intervention. It's about working with communities and often doing and supporting what they're already doing, right? So I think I'd like to see more attention to that in sort of data development in this field, and also I think that's going to be extremely important when we are in this very flux that we are at the moment, and very important for the actors, the groups, the agents, people, civilians themselves.
Thank you, Gyda. And I'd like to open the floor to questions from the audience. So if there are any questions, please signal to those who have the mics. I just want to throw something out there before we open up for the audience. And that is the question that I think Gyda kind of touched upon, which is, when is it enough data? I mean, and in the introductory remarks, Branka encouraged us to think about moving from data to action to peace. So do we really need more data in order to justify action at this moment? When do we reach that threshold where, okay, enough's enough now, we can justify action and hopefully then peace. So that's just what I want to throw out there. What are we going to do with all this data that's going to be generated through AI, for example? How are we gonna put that to use? And then, of course, in this project, kind of the answer to that is that maybe we also need to look at more systematically atrocity prevention mechanisms that have already happened, and that can maybe be an inspiration for action. Okay, so any questions from the floor? Yeah, one here. Please say who you are and...
Hello, I'm Simon. I work at the Peace Research Institute Oslo, where I'm the Director of Technical Development for the Violence and Impact Early Warning System. So, cool panel, also cool people. So well done you. Håvard, you mentioned it a little bit under your breath, but you did say it, the lack of political will. So we already know a lot about what works in peace building and atrocity prevention, especially like Lawrence and his team, but we also know that there is a lack of political will. There's a reason that both ACLED and UCDP and VIEWS is not as well funded as Palantir, because we try to do peace stuff and not war stuff. And we will not reconsider that yet, so we'll stay on the good side. But so one thing is that we can try to figure out what works, but if nobody is willing to actually do anything about it, is there any way that we can use any of the data we have or any of the forecasting or risk assessment tools we have to either keep people accountable or to generate some political will? Because without that, our insight is not really going to do a lot.
Thank you. Other questions from the audience?
I'll go next. Kati Yunkishi from ACLED. This is maybe a question more for Håvard, but of course anyone. So Håvard, you mentioned how, I think a very important point, that we often see violence against civilians within contexts of armed conflict in general. And I think one thing that's quite important is thinking about how targeting civilians is a tactic. It's not a byproduct of a conflict that someone else is engaging in. So actors, depending on where they are in their life cycle or where they are in sort of resource development, et cetera, may go out of their way to target civilian populations. Or they may go out of the way to avoid targeting civilian populations if they want to recruit or things like that. So I'm curious, I guess, if that element factors into thinking about where atrocities may crop up, is thinking about sort of where are actors in their life cycle, what are the motivations of actors vis-a-vis, you know, if they may target civilians.
Okay, we'll start with those two questions. The first big one, lack of political will. Yeah, war seems to be a lot more profitable, and it is, of course, than peace. Everybody's gearing up for war. It seems like no one is gearing up for peace. So this question maybe could go out to both Magnus and Lawrence and Håvard. In your work, how's when you come up with, for example, the Uppsala data, or your annual presentation of risks, or the reports from VIEWS, how is this perceived? Do you get any responses from the policy community? Are they interested in that at all? And how can this bridge be built? And then, yeah, there was this question also particularly to you from ACLED on the targeting and the remark on targeting civilians as a tactic in itself. So Magnus, let's start with you.
Well, there is a great interest in our data from policymakers and from news outlets and all kinds of, especially when conflicts increase. It was much harder in the early 2000s and the late 1990s to convince or get an interest when the trends were the other way. So there's more interest now, not more funding necessarily, but more interest. But what I would say about the political lack of political will, yes, at this international level, perhaps, but there is, if we're going back to the local communities, I don't imagine they lack the will. So understanding what works for local communities, what can they do? And there is research on, for example, communities declaring themselves neutral and weapons-free zones and things like that, with varying success in Indonesia, in Colombia, and in other places. And so there are things that people locally can do, and they certainly are motivated. They don't lack the will. And for them, they need more information and to know better, or so that they can be informed about what strategies they might have and which ones might work under what circumstances and so on.
Thank you. Lawrence.
Yeah, I think to Simon's question, two thoughts. First, I think we could, as analysts, treat political will as an exogenous factor and basically say what we want to do is prepare for the time that there is someone in the user audience who's interested in doing something, and provide them then with the best analysis and data and supportive evidence to be able to make the best use of the resources that they're choosing to invest. I think the complementary way of thinking about it is to think that sometimes demonstrating that there's a way actually can affect the level of will. So if we can demonstrate that these things are not spontaneous, actually you can identify the warning signs in advance, you can identify where to focus, where the risks are greatest, and you can identify a range of possible options for what to do, and perhaps even identify a smaller set that seem most promising in that particular context. It may be more difficult for somebody to say, well, we're not going to do anything, because actually you've made it a lot easier on them to choose something that will actually help accomplish that goal.
Håvard.
So, I mean, large reason for the work that very many in this audience do like USDP, ACLED, views, everybody doing forecasting is to put focus on the conflicts, saying they are here. Lots of conflicts that are completely forgotten in the news. So the continuous monitoring by USDP and ACLED and forecasting by views and other forecasting systems will display on maps. These are places where nobody talks about at the moment. So that's one way to try to stimulate more political will to this as a social problem. In views, we've now preparing a new part in order to strengthen that message. So we are building a impact forecasting system. So where we take some humanitarian variables like infant mortality or undernourishment and education levels, and forecast them, what is the increase in mortality relative to the counterfactual without conflict. So in what will be presented later in this workshop, we show that 150,000 infants dies, or there are 150,000 additional infants that die because of conflict that would not have died in the counterfactual of no conflict wherever. So kind of try to put the numbers out there. These are the consequences of the violence that is going on. So, that's one way to try to increase awareness of this and make some more responses. As for Kation's question, that was actually something on my blog. I think in order to look at the case selections, I think looking at the variation between actors is an excellent idea. It's both where are they in the life cycle, but there are also other differences between actors, like ideology. Some institutions, at the government side, there are institutions that constrain them one way or the other. So I think looking at the excellent actor data in the USDP and ACLED and compare actors that vary in terms of how much violence they make use of in their struggle against a political opponent is really useful to prevent atrocities.
If there aren't any other questions, then there's plenty of questions. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for the great panel. You've touched on it like very briefly, but can you share if there's any learnings from the humanitarian community when it comes to community-based protection from violence work, and how is that contributing to reduction of atrocities, or or if there are any ways actually, or if any challenges that are related to taking learning from that community, and also sharing learning from the research to support programming around protection from violence and humanitarian action.
Can you repeat the last sentence, please?
The challenges in the two sides, sharing learning from the research to support protection from violence and humanitarian action, and vice versa, taking learning from the humanitarian community into research, into prevention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting discussion. My name is Yumiko. I'm an independent expert on water governance and a researcher as well. Also have affiliation with Uppsala University and the Research School on Water Cooperation. I have a couple of questions. I'm hearing these questions about when is enough data, and that's really a big question for me. And related to this, and you mentioned that also there's a lot of situation being forgotten. So like, you say that, you have to also show with the data to highlight that has been forgotten. And that makes me so wonder, from you are all expert in this, what sort of, maybe how much percentage of all the data that's been collected do you think has been actually used or useful, or do we not know that at all? And also, I'm also wondering, my related question is, do you think all this data that's been collected has been utilized for goodwill? Or perhaps, has there been any backlash that it's been used by like the bad guys, so to say, because it's a sensitive data that can actually, stimulate the conflict? And I think particularly at the local levels, that some of the things could be used by a bad intention. Of course, there is really difficult to control who uses those data for what, but I just wanted to hear if you have any comments on that. And then my other question is a little bit related to the previous, not this panel, but previous two presentations. One presentation was very much based on the data using the AI. In another presentation was cautioning about the use of AI in this context. So if any of the panels had that comment on that point. Thank you so much.
And then there was a question here. We'll take that as well, and then we will have comments from the panel.
Thank you very much. I'm Marlene, working for UN Human Rights. So the first question will not surprise you very much, but talking about atrocity crimes specifically, how do you see the role of judicial accountability and political will? How could this be used more efficiently, maybe? Because in some crimes, to say there is no political will is just not good enough for me. There is an accountability that is created also through the commission of those crimes and violations. Then I also wanted to hear a bit more about the cost of doing nothing. Might this be a strategy that can be used maybe more efficiently sometimes with decision makers to show them more clearly? If you decide to not do anything, well, there is also a cost implicated. Maybe the humanitarian data that you were referring to is going a bit in this direction. And then maybe if you have some positive examples of how the data and the research was used to have a positive impact, that would be interesting to hear. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you. So that was a question about both accountability and how that might create political will, right? And the cost of doing nothing and actual examples. I'd like to start with the first question on learning from the humanitarian community. I know you, Gida, you worked with peacekeeping NGOs. I don't know if you can reflect on that, on the sort of learning both ways, if that's something you could comment on.
Yeah, I think this also reflects onto the discussion we had about lack of political will, right? Because I think a lot of you in the room are working in the political space, and certainly you don't feel that you lack political will. You're working every day and very hard related to these questions. So it's so often that time that's more about a sort of, when Hova says that, I assume it's more about a structural problem of the international system and decline of the wider peace building willingness or more systematically intervene. But I think what we've learned from a lot of the work that I and colleagues in different international NGOs have been doing, including the Folke Bernadotte Academy, is really a fantastic example of this, is to draw on this sort of feedback loop on working between collecting research data, working with local NGOs, local actors, etc., and then providing that support and evidence of what they need, but also providing that feedback loop and sort of lessons learned through those types of mechanisms. And there's a lot of fantastic work that's happening in that space, and that can be brought forward. In terms of how research then can feed into that, it's a lot about acknowledging what does the data tell you that is actually useful. Which is the challenge, which is why it's so important to bring those interactions together. There are a lot of examples where this is happening in terms of local peace communities in Colombia, which was mentioned here. Support for civil society peace-building communities in Myanmar who are working and trying to sort of navigate that space. It's also quite sensitive sometimes, so that's also probably why we don't always have all the information about what's going on in real life and as we speak. But yeah, I think there's a lot of promise in this space of learning and feedback loop through these mechanisms. Thanks.
And then the question of data, is it, you know, to what degree is it actually useful? And the question of data backlash, and I guess connected to that, the question about AI. I don't know, Mikael, if you want to reflect on particularly maybe the last one.
Yes, well, I think two points I could make is first that we are, like, if we are referring to the data that we use, if we train models, then we are using a lot of data for decades. For instance, in the infrastructure of use or UCDP, we have decades of data that we can use for training purposes. Then what signal we extract is another matter and a matter of modeling. And I also want to, like, coming back to the near misses and the false positives, those are also artifacts of the models that we use. So that's why we need to think that if we are going to use near misses, we have to think that we are trying to find the missing variable, basically, because it's not in the model then, because then it would give us that signal that we are after. That was one thought. I think that we can also use data, like if we are putting on the table that the counterfactual is not accessible to us, then maybe we can do our best to model it. And that's also how we can use data. And there are excellent tools, both in machine learning and also in applied econometrics, of constructing these counterfactuals. So maybe like thinking of cases that may have similar trajectories in terms of fatalities or in terms of one-sided violence, it may be difficult to find those cases. But then if we can do our best to construct the counterfactual, and again, the matching part, like we can even match on the propensity score of something happening. So there we have kind of the best match. One last thing about AI. Well, no. I'll stop there for the interest of time.
Okay, we have only 4 minutes left, so I want to wrap up with the panelists. I just want to comment on the issue of accountability, since we are here discussing atrocity crimes. So when we're at that level of attacks on civilians, whether through war crimes or direct attacks on civilians, we are talking about acts that are forbidden, that shouldn't happen. And I think in terms of whether accountability mechanisms, for example, investigative commissions or even legal or judicial mechanisms can create political will, well, maybe they can create some, at least I think. For instance, more specifically, if there is a risk that there is a situation of an ongoing genocide, then that should affect weapons sales, for instance. So that's a very specific way it can have an effect. But I also think we should reflect on what is prevention, what do we mean? And this is just making all the issues you've pointed to, Lawrence, even more complicated, because it's not all or nothing. It's not as if you're looking at, a perfect world where there are no attacks on civilians, prevention can be reduction of suffering, mitigation efforts. So it's not just sort of reducing attacks on civilians or sending in food. Is that prevention, or is it just, what is it really? I mean, so this is just making it even more complicated. It's really blurring the categories. Jenny, if you want to make some final remarks on this panel, we have 30 seconds each. Håvard, start with you.
No, this has been great. I'll use my 30 seconds to answer the question about what backlash if this is used by the bad guys. I think one thing which might stand a response to that question is that they know better than we do. What we do is just to make this information public available. It's a matter of transparency. So monitoring this conflict, making forecasts about and thinking about risk is a way to make the entire world, those that have interests in preventing this, something that the local actors don't necessarily have, to make that publicly available and part of the public discourse in order to inspire action.
Yeah, Lawrence. 20 seconds for you.
All right. On the accountability question, I forgot to mention the website where you can find the results of our big research review. It's preventiontools.ushmm.org. I'm happy to circulate that. But prosecutions is one of the tools that we reviewed the research on. There's an extensive literature, so you can go there and see all the factors that we drew out of all that research and which are associated with greater effectiveness. Very quickly, I think on the humanitarian point, to me that's an example of a broader important point, that we need more conversations and dialogue across our small professional communities that are kind of defined in these ways that sometimes impede important cooperation across these lines, both in the practitioner domain and in the researcher domain, so that we make sure that the research is actually adding up to more than what each individual study engages or finds, and that those are effectively transmitted to the practitioners.
Gita, you got
Great.
15 seconds.
Great, thank you so much. I think I want to highlight that it's not necessarily always an outcome that is the important thing to study when it comes to what we need data about all the time. But the trajectory of change, really. So the trajectory of reduction in risk, for instance. So how does that happen? And we can draw a lot of lessons from other fields and areas of research to capture that. I also wanted to echo the lightning talk earlier that was highlighting the importance of qualitative data sets. And this is also one area. I think we are lacking systematic data on some of these areas, so just responding to your question as well. But it's true, there's a lot of data and importance of, and we've seen that through the presentations today as well. So it brings to the surface the question of when is enough, or when do we need more?
Michaela.
5 seconds. Yes, so we have touched on many challenges. I want to just say that if we are interested in assessing a causal effect, we first need to start with knowing which is the factor we want to assess. And secondly, if we are interested in intervention and targeting, we need to be able to connect that targeting to the actor we are interested in. So those are two kind of.
Magnus, you represent sort of the host institution in a way.
Yeah, I'll just say on the question of accountability. I think data can be and have been used in court cases as impartial evidence of what happened. That so there is that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for participating in this talk on atrocity prevention.